So this is our panel on, as we've called it, safe spaces, trigger warnings, free speech on campus. Everybody knows who I am. In a moment, I'll introduce my two co-panelists, but I want to say a few words about how we want to proceed in this panel. Part of the idea here, in fact, most of the idea here, is to get questions and comments from the audience. You guys are all in school, and you're experiencing what's happening on campus today. So we very much want to hear from you and get your questions. So that's a large part of what the panel will be. In fact, I'm going to keep my remarks quite short after introducing my fellow panelists, and then they'll both speak for a few minutes, and then we'll get going and just open it up for questions. A couple words just before I say a few words about the topic. I think I want to prioritize questions that have to do with freedom of speech on campus or issues related thereto. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't ask questions about other topics in free speech, but I really want to try to get through the questions and the focus on campus issues. Since that's the subject, and since it's a very important subject, and it's a subject that you all are experiencing right now, so I may have to mediate a bit on the questions. Anyway, so let me introduce my panelists first. Then I'm going to say a few words, and then we'll move on to them. To my immediate left is Jason Hill. Jason is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University. He specializes in ethics, social and political philosophy, and a long list of other things that I didn't put down on here, but I invite you to check him out on DePaul's website. I have to point out one book. He's the author of a number of books, and I know he's working on, I think it's 3 right now, but one really caught my eye, so I want to read the title, Civil Disobedience and the Politics of Identity, When We Should Not Get Along, which I just think that's a great topic. I'm going to have to read that one. So, but anyway, welcome to Jason. To Jason's left is Nico Perrino. Nico is the Director of Communications at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, otherwise known as FIRE. I hope most of you have heard of the organization. They champion not only free speech on campus, but really individual rights on campus in general, although I think they're probably these days most known for their work on freedom of speech. Among other things, Nico speaks about the issue and also is the host of their podcast, which is called So to Speak. Is that right?
Yeah, So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast.
Good. Okay, so I want to just set the context a bit. I mean, I think most people are aware of, I've referred to it often as the culture of sensitivity on campus. Other people have referred to it as the offense culture on campus. It manifests itself in such things as trigger warnings, microaggressions, safe spaces, and just a general tenor of taking offense at things and trying to shut down free speech. It goes as far as to shut down free speech. What it is that it is part of the subject of the panel. So I want to try to dig down on that a bit. But I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about examples. I'm hoping my co-panelists will talk about examples, and I would rather let them talk. You've already heard from me. But what I do want to do is really think a bit about, so I want to kind of get you guys primed to ask questions and then share your experiences with us as we're all talking up here. And the types of questions that I think are worth dealing with are what is going on campus, if anything. Is it a passing fad or a real trend? What are the actual implications? Are there real implications for free speech? I think the answer to that is yes, and if you read my book, Defending Free Speech, you'll see that and listen to the talks that I've given, but that's debatable. What's causing this to happen? Is there something unique about millennials? Is this a product of ideas? Again, I tend to go with it's a product of ideas. Are all of the examples that we often hear about in the media the types of things that we really should condemn? Is there I tend to be, I guess I would describe myself as both critical and to some extent impatient with what I would call the offense culture, but I'm not quite sure that's right. I think just to sort of plant the seeds of an idea in your head that I hope we'll get to, ideas or terms like trigger warning, microaggression, and safe spaces are easy to make fun of, and I think there's a whole lot wrong with these ideas. But it doesn't mean that every time the ideas are used or any time somebody invokes the concept, they're improperly doing so, or I guess I should say that there's not a grain of legitimacy to what they're saying. So part of that, I think, also is part of this debate. Now, I wouldn't use any of those terms. I think they're problematic, and we can talk about that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, I mean, this tends to be very much an issue that is reported on by the right as a way of bashing the left, that the right is not the best source of information on the left and vice versa. So we ought to be critical not only of what's happening on campus, but of what we're hearing about what's happening on campus, which is yet another reason that we want to hear a lot from you. So think about those types of issues as we go, and hopefully we'll get a good, vigorous discussion going. But with that, let me stop talking and turn it over to Jason.
Okay, good, thank you. And so I want to sort of preface my comments by saying that they'll be quite brief, I think, and to break them down into two components. One is what I would term the easy targets, that is soft-core free speech problems. And I think that quite often in the discourse, a distinction that should be made has not been made between violations of free speech in public universities and free speech violations, which are not violations, which are made in private institutions. So let me take my institution, for example, DePaul Institution, which is a private Catholic institution. And so recently there was a controversy which occurred last year in which Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a, let's just say that this man, in my estimation, I've heard him speak, who has the mind of a, how should I put it? Well, he certainly has the mouth of a pornographer and the mind of a furbished lousewort, to put it mildly, was allowed on campus to speak. He uses the C word to describe women. He's an intellectual lightweight. He's a pornographer masquerading as an intellectual, and he most certainly is not an intellectual. Now, why DePaul University, that is a private institution, a moral sanctuary for the moral sensibilities of individuals who come there to find a home for their intellectual and for their moral sensibilities, should be forced to listen to this pervert is beyond reason. You know, I was one of the very few individuals on campus who fervently defended our president, fervently and vehemently defended our president in allowing him to speak. But let me also say that had the president not allowed him to speak, I would have just as vehemently defended the president in his right to have prohibited him from speaking in the name of cultivating an environment for free speech. The point I want to make is, as a private institution, DePaul University is no more to be encouraged any more than the Ayn Rand Institute is to be encouraged to allow those viewpoints that are inimical to its mission values to espouse values inimical to its viewpoints. We don't see on this panel Maoists or Stalinists. We don't see the Wall Street Journal as a newspaper allowing left-wing pundits espousing viewpoints that are inimical to its values. So I think a distinction that has to be made quite often in the public imaginary has not been made. That is, it is only the government who has a coercive monopoly on the use of force that can exercise the use of force, invoke censorship. Private institutions, by refusing to allow individuals a platform for their viewpoints, are not prohibiting free speech. I want to make that very clear. That should be obvious, but it's not very clear. So DePaul and other private institutions that do not or prohibit individuals who are an offense to their mission statements, to their values, are not prohibiting free speech. They are simply refusing to grant an endorsement and grant a platform to individuals whose viewpoints are offensive and inimical to their viewpoints. I want to also say that some sort of package deal or the fallacy of false conjunction is being made here. That is, I respect the idea that safe spaces and microaggressive, that these arguments have some traction in the culture. But it seems to me that when I look out at what students are saying, and I have gone out and talked to students, that quite often what students are looking for is not necessarily safe spaces. They are looking for value spaces. That is, in the intellectual bankruptcy of our age, that is the nihilistic trash that is assaulting their sensibilities. Quite often what I know my students at DePaul are looking for, it's not safe spaces. They are looking for value spaces. They're looking for spaces in which they can find an endorsement, a reification of the values that they hold to be true to their systems of belief. Now, it is true that some people are being held hostage to victimology, and that some people are being held hostage to an offense culture. That is true. But I think in order to not fall victim to the fallacy of the package deal, we don't hold all persons hostage to the same standard. That is by saying that because all people are against Speaker X, it must mean that all persons are against free speech, right? So I think this is one thing to be aware of, that there are people who are members of the cult of victimology, and there are people who are members of the offense culture, but there are also people who are very, very much in favor of looking for an endorsement and an affirmation of their values in our culture. The other thing I want to say is that free speech is very, properly speaking, very difficult to make sense of in the sense of talking about public universities. Free speech can properly only be made sense of when we speak of private universities, because the First Amendment really is something that upholds the moral property one holds in the inviolable value one holds in the rightful use of one's mind and the rightful expression of the judgments of one's mind, fallacious or correct, and the pronouncements and the utterances of those judgments. So free speech is part of the process of cognition that we engage in as members of a social polity or as part of a society to arrive at the proper epistemological standards and methods of living as human beings in a society. And as such, I think, as Rand stated quite properly, the state has no business being the arbiter of what counts as ideologically proper. Okay, having said that, we do have a system of public education, and it's not going anywhere. So I think for all sake of argumentations, we could all sort of say, well, we should privatize education. We probably should, but today we have a system of public education and higher education. So what should we do? Well, here's where I just want to offer a couple of thoughts about what we should do, given the fact that the state does have a coercive monopoly on the use of force, and that we do have state education, public funded education in higher education. And furthermore, that there is no such thing as a value-free context in education. That is, in my classroom, there is no such thing as freedom of speech. No student has the right to use expletives in my classroom. He or she is banished from the classroom permanently. That is, there are always prisms and frames of references through which debates and conversations get filtered. So having said that, I think that it is time, in the context of state education, for the state to do a couple of things. And when I say the state, I'm going to hear speak about America. So I think what has to be done is for the state to revert or to reverse its ideological agnosticism by asserting the supremacy of what America stands for. And what America stands for is individualism and individual rights. What America stands for is free enterprise and capitalism. What America stands for, what it was forged, the crucibles in which it was forged is reason and constitutional republicanism. I think in the public educational system, when the state begins to stop acting in the spirit of agnosticism and neutrality and assert the supremacy of its values, then the prisms and the contexts through which a vetting process can occur to determine who gets let on campus and who is not permitted to speak on campus can be made much, much more transparent. Now, there's much more I could say, but I don't want to go over the 10 minutes, so these are just sort of starting points. And I will entertain your questions later on and maybe flesh out the details of what's just a starter here.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, Nico.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Steve, for having me, and thank you for not putting a trigger warning on my remarks. I hope no one runs out of the room as I begin them. It's really exciting to be here, especially exciting to be here when we're talking about free will. Because for me, free speech is really the ability to be who you are and speak your mind. When I checked in yesterday, I was telling Steve this, there's a sign with an Ayn Rand quote in it, and the quote in part says that the creator is the man who disagrees. And free speech is really our vehicle to allow that man who disagrees to speak out and represent themselves. Voting takes care of the consensus, it takes care of the majority, but we really need that right to free speech to protect the man who disagrees. And we can quibble about whether that right to disagree is important on college campuses, but I think it really, really is for the reason that Mr. Brooks spoke about last night. Because ideas start with intellectuals. They start with thinkers. I don't know if there's anybody here who's familiar with the Hayekian theory of social change, but the idea that ideas start with intellectuals on college campuses, filter through think tanks and communicators to voters, and then the politicians and the policy choices that they make are really the outcome. Steve gave a great introduction to FIRE. We do free speech on college campus work. We do other work as well, the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, a free press, religious liberty, freedom of speech, the right to assemble, and to the extent that anyone does it on campus, the right to petition, I guess. We do privacy work and we do due process work. And for the 17 years that we've been around, most of what we've done is fight bad acting administrators. Administrators who are trying to protect their fiefdoms by telling students that they need to go off into far-off free speech zones to interact with other students, telling college faculty members that they can't explore controversial research topics because it might make the environment on campus too toxic. But as Steve pointed to and Jason spoke about briefly, recently we've seen at FIRE, since about 2013, bad acting college students. And I think Jason and I are going to have a bit of a disagreement here that I'm willing to flesh out in the Q&A. But they're demanding censorship on college campuses using a new tool, using therapeutic arguments. I call it the medicalization of censorship. The idea that if you have a controversial viewpoint, or you have a viewpoint that is the dissenter or disagrees with other people, that could be psychologically harmful to you. And that manifests itself on college campuses with demands for trigger warnings, demands for intellectual safe spaces, demands for microaggression policing, and demands for disinvitation. And now, Steve, when you asked me to give my remarks here, you asked me to sort of flesh out these terms, because there's a lot of disagreement about the definition. So I want to start with trigger warnings. From the very get-go, a trigger warning is essentially, and again, we have problems with definition here, a content warning on academic material. FIRE has no problems with content warnings on academic materials. If Jason wants to put one on his syllabus or on a piece of material, that is his academic freedom right to do so. In the same vein, it is another professor's academic freedom right to not do so. We see students demand trigger warnings on Ovid's Metamorphosis because it has content dealing with sexuality. We've seen demands within Harvard University law courses about rape for trigger warnings because there's rape. And it stems from this idea of PTSD that discussion of this content could be triggering for someone with PTSD, which doesn't have a lot of scientific backing, because if you talk with psychologists, and we can discuss this as well, they'll often say that you never know what's going to be triggering. It could be a sight, it could be a sound, it could be a smell. We often see it manifest itself in Victorian ways, these demands for trigger warnings. At Crafton Hills Community College, there was a student who demanded trigger warnings on a class about graphic novels because those graphic novels might include nudity. And these students demanded the professor who gave this course get fired. So that's trigger warnings. Safe spaces. FIRE also has no problem with a safe space. It's inherent within your freedom of association right to exclude certain viewpoints. As Jason was talking about here, this is an intellectually safe space for people to discuss Ayn Rand's ideas without the heckler in the back, the Maoist in the back shouting us down. Where we get a problem with safe spaces and was when those safe spaces start being used as a sword and get manifest destiny to sweep within their ambit those of us who do not want to be within the safe space. So you have college students saying, I don't just want my college environment to be a safe space physically, but I want it to be a safe space for me psychologically. So I want you to exclude people like Milo Yiannopoulos or Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Condoleezza Rice, because they are violating my deeply held beliefs. And they're using the language of violence often to do this. It is a psychological attack on you. Microaggressions, another term that's hard to define, but generally means unintentional slights that take a racist or a sexist or other form. They've been described by certain commentators as paper cuts of oppression. And down the road at Northwestern, Morton Shapiro, the president there, got in a bit of hot water because he's been very critical of people who are critical of microaggression theory. And he said during one of his speeches that people who disagree with microaggression theory are crazy and insane. And we wrote at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education that President Shapiro was talking about microaggressions, arguing about microaggressions, and losing, because in describing people who are critical of microaggressions, he used himself microaggressions, the idea being that insane and crazy are ableist and exclusionary, and the student newspaper actually that supports microaggression policing actually had to come out and condemn him for doing that. So it goes to show that it's unintentional. And we at FIRE, and I think most of us, think that President Shapiro's argument was a strongman, because there's very few people that don't believe that we can engage in unintentional slights against other people. That's, I think, a fact of life. The question is, how serious are these slights? How should they be policed? And what they are. We do have a definition of terms here. And then there are the disinvitations. There are the inviting of speakers to campus and then subsequently disinviting them. You got that with Christine Lagarde. You got that with Condoleezza Rice. You got that with Bill Maher. And then you have schools like DePaul, and we'll, I'm sure, debate DePaul, that are going a step further and outright banning speakers like Ben Shapiro, who's the conservative commentator for the Daily Wire, formerly of Breitbart, Milo Yiannopoulos, for example. We recently came to the defense of a student group at DePaul, the DePaul Socialists, that wanted to invite a professor who's written one of the most seminal Marxist texts. And the student group was told by DePaul's administration that they would need to pay $400 in security fees in order to bring this person to campus. We call this a speech tax. It's a tax on controversial speech. And I think it's worth getting out there right now that FIRE has no problems with private universities that decide that they place certain values above free speech. Liberty University, Brigham Young University, I know there's some Brigham Young students here, very clearly place certain values above free speech. The problem is when a private university promises it to its students and faculty, that students who matriculate there and its faculty who take agreements there, that they get free speech rights, and then they renege on those free speech rights. We got involved at DePaul in 2005, and the president, because there was a group of students who wanted to disinvite Ward Churchill. He's a he lost his appointment as a faculty at University of Colorado because he said that 9/11 was a good thing and that the little Eichmanns in the World Trade Centers deserved to burn. And we defended his right to speak at DePaul, and so did the president of DePaul University, who in 2005 said that the university is committed to working with any student group and bringing speakers to campus. Students have the opportunity to hear these ideas firsthand from the women and men, sometimes famous and other times infamous, like Milo Yiannopoulos, who advocate them. In many cases, students will reject these ideas, and rightly so, but they will do so after having heard them firsthand. Now, our opinion at FIRE is if a private university doesn't want that to be the acting principle anymore, then they need to tell their students who come there firsthand. Yale promises the right to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, and challenge the unchallengeable. Last year, I think, challenged them on that commitment. And if that commitment no longer stands, I think they need to live up to it. But I'll end there because I'm probably over my 10 minutes, and we're
Thanks. So why don't people start making their way to the microphones? But as people are doing that, I want to try to distill a couple points that both Jason and Nico have touched on, and then just offer, or maybe I'll exercise the moderator's privilege and ask the first question. But so Jason raised the point that that we have to make a sharp distinction between public and private universities. And I mean, that's definitely true. And the issue of when we're speaking in strict legal terms, free speech is only an issue on public universities. In other words, there's
the First Amendment is.
The First Amendment, yeah. Although, I mean, and part of what we should do is, I think, tease out what we mean by free speech, and I'll let that come out kind of organically as we answer questions. But I do think you definitely have to make a distinction between governmental action and private action. And I agree with Jason that private individuals can't violate the rights of other people, free speech, unless they actually use force against them. But the real issue when it comes to First Amendment and free speech typically is government versus private individuals and government clamping down. So public universities create an irresolvable dilemma. But private universities definitely have the right to engage in and support whatever speech they want. And it's not a violation of anybody's rights for them to do that. But one question I have, and because I think ideas definitely matter, and our ideas about free will and free thought and discussion and learning and education have a bearing on our ultimate views about what should be allowed to happen in society and the laws that we make. And I think actually you can trace, there's a connection between views of free speech and, say, hate speech laws in Europe. And that's one of the things that concerns me. But the question I want to pose, and maybe you guys can touch on this really briefly, if you wouldn't mind, is how should universities, because they are educational institutions, how should they approach the issue of, let's put aside the issue of free speech, I want to be a little clearer, and talk about controversial ideas and challenging ideas, and ideas that will even, not just anger people, but are false ideas. To what extent should students be exposed to that? To what extent is it within the mission of the university to invite even people on campus that they would strongly disagree with? Why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, Jason?
Right. Well, I'm enough of a Millian, that is a John Mill scholar here, to invoke the Millian harm principle, and to say that that when harm is done or inflicted on people, either physically, that is, speech is an incitement to violence, then it most emphatically cannot be permitted, in the same way that one cannot shout fire in a theater for obvious reasons, or that for proper reasons, constitutional scholars are now perusing Donald Trump's speeches and realizing that the man inappropriately has been inciting some of his followers to violence. I think this is uncontroversial. It's quite obvious that he's been doing this, and it's inappropriate. That when people come on campus and they use inflammatory language that can incite people to violence, that can't be secured. The second thing I would say is that there are certain, and I'm going to be very controversial here and say that
Controversy is not allowed.
Well, I'm going to say that that we probably historically have reached a point in our development as human beings, as a civilized society, where there are unassailable norms that have secured personal identity. Mm-hmm. That people historically, blacks, women, gays and lesbians, transgendered people, all sorts of persons who have been, and I'm not part of the cult of victimology, I'm not a politically correct person. I speak as a gay person who cannot stand identity politics, as you all know who've read my work. But there are people who have been historically marginalized and who have been persecuted, who are just downright sick and tired of having their identities be criminalized, trivialized, and ostracized. Mm-hmm. And that we have what I would call secure the unassailable norms that secure the unassailability of personal identity. And that universities have the right to ensure that, for example, certain speakers like Milo cannot come on campus and use the C word to address women. That's just impermissible. I'm sorry. We're not going to permit that in civilized society. And we're not going to allow, he's not comparable to Condoleezza Rice. Mm-hmm. And he's not comparable to Ali, who wouldn't use that sort of language. So in an imperfect world, conceptual distinctions and moral distinctions and qualitative distinctions have got to be made. Mm-hmm. So I would say when the harm principle is invoked, and you can demonstrate that there have been several cases of harms that have been done to people, both physical and demonstrably psychological harms, then that is a litmus test that I would invoke.
Mm-hmm. All right, Nico.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up John Stuart Mill. I'm also Millian. His book On Liberty, I think, is one of the best books written on free speech. But in that book, he said that watchmen go to sleep when there's no enemy in the field. That is, teachers and learners both go to sleep when there's no enemy in the field. So it's important for us who care about knowledge and care about argumentation that there be someone who disagrees with us. A lot of you here, I'm sure, believe in the theory of gravity, believe that the Earth is round. But how, if you were confronted with someone who didn't believe in gravity, who believed that the Earth was flat, how would you make the argument to them that there is gravity and that the Earth is round? We don't have to do it often. So for many of us, that might be a challenge. So knowledge remains vibrant in confrontation with error. John Stuart Mill also talked about how if you have a belief and it's never exercised, it becomes like a dead dogma. So you need to have other ideas out there to challenge those beliefs. I recently interviewed Deborah Lipstadt, who was a professor at Emory University, who was sued for libel by David Irving, a well-known Holocaust denial, because she criticized him. David Irving was subsequently in 2005 jailed in Austria for Holocaust denial. And Deborah Lipstadt said, we need to have David Irving's out there because we need to bear witness to what happened during the Holocaust and continue to remind people what happened. Otherwise, we'll just hold this historical truth as a dead dogma. I don't, and I'm not saying this is what Jason says, but I don't believe that, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. I don't believe that we've reached the end of knowledge and therefore can start making determinations on what arguments we can and can't have are worth having or worth not having anymore, because I have this sort of epistemological humility that I don't think I know everything. So I don't want to trust anyone else with knowing anything either. The Milo question. Milo is, by all accounts, an important person. But his ideas gain traction with a broad swath of the population. And if we're going to defeat those ideas, if anyone's going to defeat those ideas, you need to know what those ideas are. I hate talking about the Hitler comparison, but Hitler was banned in Bavaria when he was rising to power. And if you read Fleming Rose's book, The Tyranny of Silence, he talks about how Goebbels used this as a tactic to boost his popularity by saying, alone amongst, I think it was 1 billion people in the world at the time, alone among 1 billion people, there's only one man who cannot speak in Bavaria. And that argument made him ever more popular. And by banning Milo, you're doing the same thing. There's one man who can't speak, on college campuses in this country? What are our so-called thought leaders trying to tell us? So I'll just leave it at that.
Right. Let's go to the first question over here.
Yeah, hello, I'm Josh. I go to Oregon State University, and I recently tried to run for the treasurer position in my dorm hall. In the campaign that I ran, I jokingly used Soviet imagery just to, kind of...
What?
I had campaign
Jokingly
slogans
Soviet
somewhat
imagery.
similar to, like vote Josh Aikens for czar, the only treasurer who can run our money. And they took it down because people went to the resident director and started complaining about, how the Soviet imagery, the sickle and hammer, was offending them and that they felt that they were psychologically damaged by seeing it. And I now have several meetings that I need to have with university officials. So I guess what I'm looking for is generally how should I approach this, and what arguments can be made against this sort of putting up posters that may or may not offend people on campus.
So let me react first to that by first saying I'm surprised that anybody's offended by a hammer and sickle on today's campuses, but that's just me. I don't know. And Nico, maybe you can comment a little bit on how he can handle it, if you don't mind. But let me just say just one quick comment, and maybe both you guys can comment on this. So part of, Jason, you raised the issue of harm, and certainly physical harm, and the initiation of force is a harm. Probably none of us disagree with that. I have to say I'm skeptical or concerned about the idea of broadening harm to the psychological. It's not to say that I don't think there's such a thing as psychological harm. It is to say that it's a very fishy concept. It is very difficult to define, and I see the same concept being used in Europe now with hate speech laws, and my big concern is now, if from a legal standpoint, it's really, I think, arguably just not a proper thing for the law to outlaw without some sort of physical intrusion. But leaving aside whether you agree with me on that, part of, I think, what we are seeing is this kind of an example where people, there's a kind of infantilization of students today, this idea that, for God's sakes, a joke about, using a hammer and sickle, and then people saying this, does violence to me, and I feel like I'm harmed I find that hard to take seriously. Now that's not to say that the other things that you were talking about, I think much of what you said is we have to really think hard about this, and there are perspectives that are easy to miss, and I don't claim to know, how people who really are concerned about this kind of speech, or not necessarily this kind of speech, but how they feel about it and what the reactions are. But there does seem to be I'll use the term slippery slope, and I'm wondering what both you guys think about this. So Nico, if you could address what do you do? Yeah. And Jason, if you might speak to the issue of, I hate to put it as where do we draw the line, but do you see any concern with the idea of broadening harm to psychological harm in that way?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying submit a case to fire, because that seems like something that we might get involved in. Although I should note that the residential hall environment is a little bit different for free speech than, say, the campus quad. And Jason spoke to this earlier about how there's different prisms, the classroom prism, the residential prism. But as far as residential speech goes, that's about as benign as I've seen. We dealt with a case at the University of New Hampshire where a student, disgustingly, but I think protectedly, put up a poster because he was frustrated with people taking the dorm room elevators who lived on the first floor. He said, well, if you want to lose the freshman 15, why don't you take the stairs? Yeah, so a bit rough, but this is about as benign as I've seen. You could go full Alinsky and say, well, maybe I do have Soviet communist sympathies, and this is part of my political identity, and you're attacking it by telling me I can't use it. That would be using their game. The universities love they can't enforce a lot of these policies without enforcing a double standard. So I think if you're an Alinskyite student, you can force them to play by their own game. But in this case, I think you just have a principled free speech argument that you can use advertising and marketing materials to support your campaign. I had the same issue. I was running for student government chair for my dorm room floor, and I said, "Do you want a floor captain with a little captain in him?" And I did like the Captain Morgan pose. This was when I was a freshman in college, and the idea that you have to have the most boring student government campaign in the world because anything is going to be triggering to some other student is just absurd in my opinion. But
Yeah, I would concur with Nico here. I think that simply averting your attention to something that you are insinuating could, assault your sensibilities like a poster is very different from something that is comprehensively assaulting something like your identity that is all pervasive and that you can't get away from. That's a very, very different. I think in an imperfect world, conceptual distinctions have got to be made. You can turn your attention from a poster in a way that you just simply can't turn your attention from something that's an assault against your identity.
One thing I will stress here that you guys, Jason, I think agrees with this. Nico, I don't know if you spoke to this, but to really emphasize the point, privatizing education across the board would be, one step towards solving all of these problems. It should be the case, and this is one of the evils of public education, is the fact that people are effectively forced to associate with people that they vehemently disagree with, which is I think it's a monstrous thing. It's not taken that way today at all, and it's really a horrible thing for people to be taxed, to be, put in a situation where they have to support speech that they disagree with. Thomas Jefferson actually spoke about that as a grave violation of one's free speech. If you need more arguments for privatizing education, this is certainly one of them.
Can I push back against
that?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just a little bit, because I don't know that would solve the problem. And my personal ideas about private versus public schooling aside, we're seeing these assaults on free speech on private campuses that contractually promise you free speech rights. So Yale tells its students and faculty that they have free speech rights and then reneges on those promises. And if a private institution is if anything, it's an agreement between two parties on a shared value, in this case, education. And if part of that shared value is freedom of speech, the university is obligated to give that to you. And if schools like the University of Chicago or Northwestern or DePaul or Yale or Harvard or any of these other schools promise that to you, then renege on you. How can you trust private schools to do any better? Unless you take them to court, and many students have, and argue that there's a contractual violation there. So I'm not sure it would solve it from this perspective.
Do you want to say anything
I
else?
would say that the notion of, again, and there are so many questions, the notion of free speech is on private campuses is a misnomer. It has no business being applied to private campuses any more than free speech has an application to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. It is only applicable in cases where the First Amendment is applicable, that is, where the government has a coercive monopoly on the use of force and can prohibit speech among interlocutors or persecute speech and function as the ideological arbiter and criminalizer of speech among interlocutors.
All right.
It's misapplied. In
Yeah,
the
no, I
realm.
agree with that.
Yes.
But anyway, I want to go to the next question, so go ahead.
Hi, my question is specifically for Mr. Hill, but anyone else feel free to jump in. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you suggested that public universities should assert American values and use that as the prism through which they decide who and what should be allowed to be said on campus. Am I kind of catching what you were saying in the beginning? And if so, that to me seems like a kind of dangerous proposition, as we're relying on the state to decide values and ultimately enforce them with a gun.
Well, okay, so you want me to respond?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. No, well, I think the state is public universities are being placed in a very, very untenable situation. That is, public universities are being asked to be non-ideological, are asked not to be arbiters in ideological disputes among disputants in public ideologies. And I think the only way to get to some sort of resolution towards this conflict, vis-a-vis this conflict, is to have the state, that is America, assert its values, since public education is being conducted under the auspices of the United States of America and taxpayers' money, to assert its values. It is not America is not a value-free, the state is not a value-free phenomenon. We do stand for something. What are our values? Ayn Rand wrote a very interesting text, I think in 1946, called Textbook of Americanism, arguing for something like this, which I think should be a template that informs the public institutions. We can't function as if we are a value-free, neutral phenomenon if we are going to have public funded education. We can't have public funded education and act as if we're just this value-free phenomenon. If we're going to have a system of public funded education, and for all practical purposes, it seems as if this is going to continue ad infinitum into the foreseeable future, then I think the state has got to assert its identity and say, look, here's what we stand for. We stand for capitalism. We stand for individual rights and individualism. Our constitutional Republican government was forged in the crucibles of reason. Therefore, part of how we vet speakers, for example, who come onto our campuses, is through the prism, through the lenses of these vectors. So those individuals who would spew anti-American values, those who would come from other countries, for example, like Chavez, whom the UN gave a deplorable platform, and the president of Iran who gave a deplorable platform to stand on and lambast America. Any institution, any individual coming onto a public institution and attempting to spew anti-American venom would not be permitted and could not be permitted, precisely because the state, having defined what it stands for, what its values are, could not support those voices, those ideas that are inimical to its identity, being supported by taxpayers.
Let me say one thing just before moving on to the next question. I don't quite agree with that, although I get that. So the way I would put it is, I mean, there's an irresolvable dilemma and problem and conflict with public universities that because you are by its nature. So I agree completely with what Jason said, that universities are necessarily places in which that take positions on values, and that's unavoidable. I mean, just the fact that a university, or really, you can think about this as from the standpoint of grade schools and high schools, all public schools, the very fact that they have a curriculum is making value judgments, and in effect, taxpayers are forced to pay for it. And this is why you see so many fights over what is taught in schools, and then by extension, what can be said on campuses. I don't agree with the idea that the government would then essentially impose American values on public universities. I think the only solution to this is to get the government out of funding education at all. But let me keep it at that, and then we'll go on to the next question. Go ahead.
So my favorite quote from Joseph Stalin is that ideas are more powerful than guns. We wouldn't let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? This illustrates why oppressive regimes target free speech as a threat. However, this also lends credibility to those wishing to silence speech as they deem it to be a tremendous threat to their culture and their lives. So my question is, how do we defend free speech given just how powerful and dangerous bad ideas can be alongside good ones?
I mean, the short, so a couple points quickly. One is that we have to defend the ideas that lead people to believing in and supporting free speech. So the way I often put it is, it's not enough to defend free speech as just something that doesn't cause harm to people. You often hear the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, which is actually true. But if you try to defend free speech solely on the grounds that it doesn't hurt you or doesn't kill you, you're not giving people a reason to support it, right? So you need a positive reason. And it has to be defended as a value in your life. And so, I mean, a lot of what you've heard at the conference today and what you'll hear tomorrow is one of the fundamental ideas that undergirds free speech is free will and the ability to pursue values in your life. And we ought to look at free speech as a value and free thought as a value. It's the only way that we can ultimately achieve our values. And then, I mean, there's much more to it than that, but let me leave it at that. The other thing I would say, so I'm obviously not leaving it at that. So one more point that I'll make, and then I'll turn it over to these guys, is you have to make a real clear distinction between force and speech. And that's something that's not done today. And I think part of what Jason's talking, but Jason, you should correct me if I'm wrong, is making that distinction and making the distinction between private conduct and government conduct. Private parties have the right to think and say whatever they want so long as they don't violate the rights of others. And certainly that means having private institutions that you can essentially say, this is my domain. If you don't like it, start your own damn newspaper or TV station or college or organization or club or institute. And the fact that we don't respect those lines leads to these kinds of conflicts. And I think leads ultimately to people blurring the lines and just exacerbates the violations of free speech and really just the lack of clarity that we have on these issues that leads to a lot of the types of package deals I think that Jason was talking about. But let me leave it at that and then see if you guys have additional things that you want to say or anything that you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just really quickly say that, so, you know, Joseph Stalin, or is that who you quoted?
Yeah.
Or was it Lenin?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, saying that we should censor certain ideas because they can be harmful to us. What he's essentially saying is I want to blind myself to the world, to the reality as it is. It's saying we're going to censor these people, or kill these people is probably the more accurate way to put it. All it does is allow these ideas to fester underground. Harvey Silverglade, who's a co-founder of FIRE, who said he wants to know who the anti-Semite in the room is because he wants to know who he shouldn't turn his back to. So you can only go after these ideas if you know that they exist. You can only counteract them with your ideas if you know that they exist. If you're Joseph Stalin, however, you might lose that battle because those other ideas might produce a more prosperous society. And isn't that kind of what we're all after with this free speech thing? Free speech for us is a knowledge-producing device and hopefully allows us to live freer, happier, more prosperous lives. And I think error, to the extent that it exists, is something that will work against that, and hopefully, so long as it's engaged with in a free and open encounter, as John Stuart Mill talked about, truth will win out. I don't think it'll always win out. I think the tail is probably pretty long in some cases, but I think so long as force is excluded, as it wasn't excluded in Weimar Germany, where they had hate speech laws and you had Nazis storming newspapers and radio stations and taking them over with force, as you had the same thing in Rwanda, where you had monopoly on the radio distributions there. Those are two common arguments against free speech, is Weimar Germany and Rwanda. But to the extent that you can allow truth to get out there, I think it'll win in that confrontation.
Next question.
Hello, I'm from College of Charleston. Recently, College of Charleston received a red light from FIRE, and I'm working with the Dean of Students to get College of Charleston moved from red light to yellow light. And to do that, I want to propose getting rid of the verbal abuse clause, which reads, verbal abuse defined as use of derogatory terms, foul or demeaning language, which may be accompanied by a hostile tone or intensive volume or delivery. And I know that when I present this proposal, I might get this question, and this question might be, well, how would a student feel comfortable when someone run up to them, say, faggot, and then run out? So so what would be the best response to that to protect First Amendment, to get this proposal passed?
One of you guys want to?
I can just address it generally.
Yeah,
I mean, you're talking about policy, very vague and subjective policies here. You're talking about verbal abuse, derogatory statements. My question with free speech discussions is, who are you going to trust with making these decisions? Who is the angel in the room who's the dictator who's going to determine what statement is derogatory? enough for punishment? What statement is verbal statement is abusive enough for punishment? I don't really trust anyone with that. And I think to the extent that you go after speech like that, it needs to have an objective standard that, as we like to put forth in FIRE, I think the Supreme Court in Davis v. Monroe County did this right when they said harassment, and I think that's what they're trying to get at there, needs to be severe, pervasive, and so objectively offensive that it effectively denies a student the right to an educational environment. Now, we were talking about private universities, and College of Charleston is a private university.
No, it's public.
Is it a public university?
Yes.
Okay, well then, the Davis standard applies. So.
I mean, I would say that the same sort of norms that would apply, people are going to disagree with this, but I would say civilization norms of decency, the same way that today, in a workplace, a man cannot go up to a woman and say, hey, babe, you've got a great ass, without the risk of incurring a lawsuit or being fired, that the universities have to sort of set standards of decency. So no one can reasonably call someone a faggot, or no one can reasonably call a woman on campus a slut or a whore, or there are just standards of decency that we have achieved in 2016 that have got to be adhered to. No one can call someone on campus or in a classroom if he disagrees with a viewpoint, I disagree with you, you goddamn nigger. That's not permitted in a university campus. And that is where we are in 2016, thank God. And the universities it's their right to establish those standards of decency. And students have a voice. There is something called shared governance in the universities, where the university and faculty and student council can have a voice in creating, through shared governance, these standards of decency and protocols of what is permissible and what's not permissible. Again, it's not a value-free environment in which anything goes at all.
But who determines those values is the question.
Well, the question presupposes that there's someone outside of human beings that would determine those values. I mean, who else would determine those values but...
Well, who creates the list of the words that are proscribed on a college campus? And I agree with you. In a classroom environment, you have the academic freedom, right, of course, to control it.
Right.
But, we're talking about in the campus quad, we're debating in a very heated election, controversial topics, who is going to be the authority figure that's going to come up with a list of words and phrases that are proscribed in that environment?
I guess through a democratic process of if there are sufficient voices that find the proliferation of sufficient terms to be offensive, then through a democratic process, we decide that this is not permissible anymore, and that in this 2016, it's impermissible to use these terms.
But in 1960, there would be a very different set of values that would have been pushed on college campuses.
And we've evolved beyond those, right? So I can sit here on this platform in a way that I certainly most emphatically could not have sat in 1906. And why is that? That is because of certain progressive protocols and laws and regulations and standards that we have achieved. And I'm the beneficiary of those, and I'm the legatee of those, I would call them progressive standards.
That came out, and those standards came out through debate and discussion on campus and off campus.
That's right.
In environments that the majority of Americans didn't agree with those ideas. I think it's fair to say.
Do you guys, can I just cut short the debate a little bit because I want to move on to questions? Now, I want to get more questions in. We can consider, because this is really a good debate and it's a worthwhile debate. As the moderator, I'll just toss in. I actually think that Jason is right in the sense that, I shouldn't say actually, it's definitely possible for private institutions to come up with norms of behavior and to enforce rules that work. It works in the business context. It's worked within private society from a long time in civilized society. What shouldn't happen is the government shouldn't do it. Part of the problem, again, I'll echo a theme that I've been echoing throughout, is that we have government so involved in education that everything has now become politicized, and we have to have all of this stuff reduced to rules, although I think there's more to it than that. But I do want to get more questions in. So let's continue on.
My question is primarily for Mr. Hill, but anyone who wants to answer it,
Sure.
that's fine. So I agree that legally it is acceptable for a private university to ban an intentionally provocative contrarian like Milo Yiannopoulos from speaking on their campuses, but I question how wise of a decision that is for reasons that people have expressed already. I'm fortunate enough to attend the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, which has been very good compared to other public universities on protecting free speech. For example, we had Milo speak at our university alongside a radical feminist last year, and no one died from that. And so one really important example I wanted to give was that we had a display. I entered college as a conservative Christian that was pretty open-minded, but conservative, and we had a display come to campus with these massive photos of these ripped-apart fetuses alongside dead Jewish victims of the Holocaust and dead victims of the Rwandan genocide. It was extremely controversial. People were arguing the Students for Life were called racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, and it was from the arguments that ensued from that I became supportive of abortion rights, because it got a conversation going and it got me thinking about it. So my question is, why do you not believe that the free exchange of ideas is the most powerful way of eliminating bad ideas?
I didn't say that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that's what he said.
I did say that.
I'm sorry.
I didn't say that. I said that in an imperfect world, moral and conceptual distinctions have to be made. I do not think that Milo Yiannopoulos is the moral, the cognitive, conceptual equivalent of Condoleezza Rice. And I think to put them both in the same camp is actually an obscenity. I didn't say that at all. I said that this man has the brain of a furbished lousewort and the mind of a pornographer, and that he does not belong in a university campus. Someone who calls women the C word is not the same as Condoleezza Rice, who is, as much as I might disagree with some of her policies, I respect her, and I respect her brain enormously. I didn't say that I disagreed. I'm not yielding to any of what you said at all.
I apologize. May I rephrase that question?
You may.
Do you think that there is merit to the argument that banning speakers riles up, it radicalizes the group of students that would support them? It makes the person almost into a martyr, and they rally behind them even more strongly, rather than if you just allow that person to come and then you let his ideas fall flat, as they should, then people will abandon the ideas by just letting it get aired out, and then, you see what I'm saying?
No, more so than the Wall Street Journal telling Maoists and Stalinists that, no, thank you, we don't want your opinion editorials alienate certain subscribers, they go elsewhere. If there are certain students from private universities who are going to be upset that Milo Yiannopoulos is not coming on campus, then they're free to take their $40,000 a year that they're paying at DePaul University and go to Northwestern or Loyola University and take their fees and their resources elsewhere. I don't think in a private university it alienates anyone. I think what it does in a private university, it consolidates those with value affinities, those who have and share like-minded values and opinions. And as I said, DePaul University is a moral sanctuary for people who have certain religious and secular sensibilities, who want a sanctuary in which to share their values. Rand spoke about this, who want to share their values. They're not interested fundamentally in debating the enemy or the adversary. They want to share their values. That's what private institutions do. And I don't think a private institution is necessarily concerned with debating the enemy or the adversary. Maybe a public institution can do that, any more than the Wall Street Journal is interested in debating the virtues of Stalinism against capitalism. I think at the same time, a good university, let me say as a professor in the classroom who has a very open attitude, my students have no idea what my viewpoints are, because when I teach Aristotle, Plato, Mill, Hegel, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, whom I can't stand. I teach them all equally and give voice to all of them equally with as much scholarly attention and devotion as possible, because that's the proper job of a scholar. At the same time, I will say that a good university as a bastion of learning, that's why I said I would have defended, had the university decided to allow Milo, I would have defended that decision in the spirit of free speech. In the spirit of free speech, I would have defended, and as I did, I was one of the very, very few faculty members in my university who publicly defended the president in allowing Milo to speak. I wrote an open letter to the faculty saying the president was absolutely correct. However, had the president decided not to have allowed it, I would have equally defended. Whatever the university decided in that respect would have been correct.
So your case is more of just a simple legal statement than a cultural statement.
Absolutely, that's right.
I see. Thank
That's
you.
right.
Thanks. Okay, next one over here.
Hi, this question is for Mr. Nico. Because my question is related to the previous what the previous student said about like our campus also received a red light from the fire, and basically what they stated is that like your nonprofit fire gave our campus a red light. It's worst rating for campus policy on workplace violence, bias incidents, hate crimes, and disruptive behaviors. According to Azhar Majid, the nonprofit's director of policy and reform, Majid said those words are too vague and could allow the college to discipline students for speech that should be protected. So my question is that, in terms of all the red lights and yellow lights, like how would you fit the political correctness and free speech in a public campus or public universities in terms of the principles of your foundation?
Yeah, so what was your school, by the way?
University of California.
Oh, University of California. I can't quite speak to that policy because it sounds like you read the title of the policy, but it dealt with bias incidents. When we're rating colleges, and I think this has come up a couple of times, are red, yellow, and green light ratings for colleges and universities. These are ratings that we use to judge campuses' policies, not their actions, for First Amendment protectiveness on public universities, and for free speech protectiveness, First Amendment standard protectiveness on private universities that promise free speech. So not private universities like Brigham Young or Liberty University. As far as political correctness goes, that really doesn't work within the framework of our red, yellow, and green light rating system because most of these policies don't deal with political correctness, at least to the extent that they aren't part of the environment that creates these policies. Usually these policies are overbroad harassment policies, they're free speech zone policies, they're IT use policy. The policies, we see some policies that tell you can't send disparaging remarks over email. We see in some cases very broad policies that say inappropriately directed laughter is actionable on a college campus as DePaul, not as DePaul, as Drexel University said. So it's tough discussing political correctness and their intersection with these policies. I can only say that political correctness will use these as tools to go against dissenters or people who don't speak politically correct.
Thank you.
Next one.
Hello, my name is Taylor and I attend the University of Texas. So this year we've had a couple of interesting events. On the first day of school we had a Cocks Not Glocks event since the school allowed students to carry firearms on campus. And so they brought 6,000 dildos on campus for students to carry around the whole day because ironically guns are allowed but dildos are not allowed. So it's kind of a satire. And a lot of students kind of champion this even though dildo might be offensive in a public place. And a lot of the faculty did as well and the UT student government did. Just last week we had something else that was controversial on affirmative action bake sale where if you were a Native American you could eat cookies for free, but if you were a Chinese white male it'd be $1.50. And based on how admission policies, a female was 50 cents, a white male was $1.25, and there's a whole range. And this was largely denounced by the student government, by students, and by several faculty professors. And although they both might have been inappropriate in a literal sense of what they were doing, one was taken more positively, one was taken more negatively, and I can't help but feel that neither of the events really offended anyone in the literal sense, but it was more used as a political tool to silence one team. Since they weren't offended when people brought dildos, but they were offended at this. Is the offensive term more used as a political bargaining chip to silence other views on campus? And what's your opinion on things like this?
Yeah, we have time. There's a lot packed into that one, and my mind reels as I think through all of the different things to talk about. But so I mean, there's definitely a sense in which so I'll echo a theme that I mentioned earlier, that I think people are oversensitive to all kinds of things on campus these days, and need to, I mean, I would say, to oversimplify the point, get a thicker skin about a lot. I mean, it's you know, universities are places in which people are going to debate, and they're going to act like jackasses sometimes, and you have to deal with that. But I mean, I don't have much more to say about it than that. You know, I don't think, actually, one more thing I'll say is that it tends to be cast in left-right terms, and I don't really think that that's the best way to look at it. I don't think that, I think that this is very much a thing that the right has capitalized on as a way of bashing the left. I'm highly skeptical of that. I don't think that's the right way to look at this at all. But I don't want to try to, you know, go into much more detail than that. I would resist the urge to look at this as the left bashing the right, although there is definitely some of that, and political correctness is much more of a leftist phenomenon. But I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I also think there's a distinction to be drawn here between guns and dildos and anything else. I mean, even as a Second Amendment supporter or right to bear arms supporter, I can see a perfectly rational argument for a university saying we don't want guns on campus. But I think that's a totally different issue. But I don't know if you guys have other, you know, things to say on that.
Just quickly, I mean, those were two very hot button issues on campus. Affirmative action was in the Supreme Court, I think stemming from a case at UT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And guns are allowed on campus in Texas, right?
Yeah.
So you had liberal students protesting that in a very creative way, to say the least. I interviewed Glenn Greenwald for my podcast. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. Many of you probably dislike him. But he spent the early part of his career defending neo-Nazis as a pro bono attorney in New York City. And he told me during the podcast, which was on the topic of defending my enemy, like why do people defend the rights of their enemy, that if you disagree with free speech from like a moral or ethical standpoint, you should at least agree with it from a tactical standpoint. So if you're the conservatives doing the affirmative action bake sale, protesting the right of these presumably liberal students to wear dildos in a holster, you know, they can turn that right back around on you next time you do your affirmative action bake sale, because that's just as offensive to them. So the double standard that's at play in a lot of this is the reason that we have free speech for all, I think, on a college campus, because you can't draw those lines. You can't draw those lines.
Okay, so last question.
Okay, thank you to you both. One of the big reasons there is a controversy about free speech and trigger warnings on campus is because the nature of the comments that are usually thought to be out of bounds, that people are offended by, are ones that are racially insensitive or prejudiced. And I think we can all agree that there is an oversensitivity, there's a cult of victimology, I like that phrase. But we can also agree that there are legitimately offensive and unjustifiable forms of offense. And the right of center students have gotten very active about defending free speech in recent years. Would their message be more credible if they were to be more proactive in also seeking out and condemning the legitimate forms of racial insensitivity that they find on campus? It's the accusation, and I think it's a legitimate one, that the left sometimes makes, is that the only injustice they seem to care about is free speech, that they will maybe in a perfunctory way say, yes, of course, these are offensive statements, but we're mainly concerned with free speech. And I don't want to diminish the preeminent value of free speech where that's a genuinely applicable category. But if the right were to become more proactive in its condemnation of genuine racism, would that make the right's defense of free speech more credible, particularly because the injustice of racism is just as offensive to the concept of free will as offense against free speech is?
That's an excellent comment. My answer is yes, but I also want to see what these guys say. But I think it's a really good comment.
It's a great question. It's a great comment. And as someone who identifies neither with the right nor the left, but who is an intellectual and who finds virtues in both camps, my experience is precisely that the right has been shamefully silent on a lot of issues having to do with racism, sexism, and when I was having a conversation with someone who identified with the right about Black Lives Matter, this person said, well, I really think in some sense that Black Lives Matter is a legitimate issue, that the shooting of unharmed black men in our culture is a problem, but the left has appropriated that conversation, so I don't want to have anything to do with it. And I said, well, if the left has appropriated that conversation, shame on the right for not taking up a legitimate conversation that should be handled appropriately. So the question that should be asked is, why has the right historically reneged on its responsibility, on issues pertaining to both state and private racism, sexism, homophobia, state prejudice against women and other disenfranchised groups. And when I say disenfranchised groups, I'm not talking about disenfranchised by private groups. I'm talking about disenfranchised by the state, qua state.
Okay, so great. I was actually, thanks.